Low intensity static stretching can reduce muscle soreness and actually improve your recovery time. Hey guys, this is Corey from Redefining Strength, and today I want to talk about static stretching. Should you do it? So static stretching and the whole topic of stretching in general is a very controversial subject right now. Some people think of stretching as the holy grail, it's the cure of all aches and pains, while other people demonize it, especially static stretching, when done before your workout. They think it'll kill all of their gains and decrease their performance and completely hinder their results. So what is static stretching, and does it really benefit us, or can it have a place in our routines? Static stretching is a stretch that is held basically at the end range of motion for a certain amount of time. You can do static stretching for different lengths of time, and usually you're holding when you feel a pull in the muscle at that end range of motion. But static stretching doesn't just have to be held for one length of time or at one intensity. And actually varying the intensities that you use and the length of time that you hold the stretch can really impact the results that you get from it. We have to remember that when we're using any sort of training technique, that it's only as good as our implementation. Anything you include in your workouts always needs to match your needs and goals, especially static stretching. So simply labeling static stretching as only bad or good is really sort of missing all of the different benefits that it can have for you if you implement it correctly according to your needs and goals. Because for someone, static stretching before their workout might help them really reduce their risk of aches and pains, while for someone else that might hinder their progress and their performance. So how does static stretching impact your performance and force production? So most of the time you'll hear, don't do any static stretching before your workouts. It can hinder your performance and really reduce your power. It's impacted sprinters and jumpers and elite athletes at all levels. However, most of us aren't elite athletes training for competition. We're just trying to move and feel better. Worrying about the impact that static stretching might have on our performance might not be where our attention should fall. Instead, we might want to use static stretching to help us actually increase our range of motion so that we can get more out of our training, especially if we've had a prior injury and we have underactive muscles and shortened muscles that are impacting our activation. If you've had a previous injury and you're just getting back into training, you might want to risk a little reduction in power output or even performance to make sure that you're moving well during your workouts. If you have really tight hip flexors that are inhibiting your glutes, you might find that using static stretching, because you're not going to be training with maximal loads, might end up helping you more. It's interesting to note that in a lot of these studies, the stretching is done of the agonist muscle in a movement. So it's the muscle that's the prime mover. So if you're squatting, they might stretch the quads, which will then impact their performance. Another interesting study, though, was done in 2019 where they actually stretched the antagonist muscle instead of the agonist. So the muscle that wasn't the prime mover during the movement, but actually the opposing muscle group. So say in your deadlift, instead of stretching your hamstrings, you would stretch your hip flexors. They actually found that this improved the power output and performance of the person doing the movement because you stretch the antagonist muscle to increase the range of motion. Because almost every study agrees that static stretching does increase your flexibility and does have short-term benefits in terms of improvements in range of motion. So by stretching that antagonist, you might actually improve the force output of that prime mover muscle, so your glutes and your hamstrings, by stretching your hip flexors. It's key that we realize that by stretching different muscles, we can actually get different benefits, and that by simply saying that you shouldn't do any static stretching before your workout might not be correct, because we might want to change what muscles we're actually addressing based on what muscles we're going to be working in our routines. If you are trying to train for that 1 rep max or you're about to go out and compete, it might be key that you avoid static stretching though in your warm-up and instead opt for, say, dynamic stretching, which will put your joints through a range of motion but also warm up your body. So it's really key that you focus your warm-up and your static stretching on your goals. So what about static stretching prior to your workouts and muscular strength and hypertrophy? Many studies have found that static stretching can actually negatively impact your muscle hypertrophy or your muscle gains. If you're really trying to focus your workouts on gaining muscle, you might want to exclude static stretching from your warm-up. However, again, it depends on what muscle you're actually stretching. If you stretch the prime mover, that's going to have more of a negative impact than if you stretch the opposing muscle group to help you improve that range of motion to then strengthen through the range of motion. Studies haven't shown, though, that static stretching compromises strength gains near as much as it hinders muscle gaining benefits. So if you are really focused just on building strength and not necessarily gaining muscle, you might want to include static stretching still in your routine. However, usually when we're trying to gain strength, we're also trying to build muscle, so we might want to focus our static stretching more on our cool down. It's also important that we realize that not all static stretching is created equal. By including shorter term static stretches and lower intensity static stretches, we might not actually have some of the negative impacts that longer duration and higher intensity static stretches have. So if you are going to include static stretches in your warm-up, if you keep the static stretches shorter and lower intensity, they've actually been shown that they don't nearly compromise strength gains or muscle hypertrophy to the extent that longer duration and higher intensity static stretches do. So keeping the static stretches shorter and lower intensity while even potentially focusing on that antagonist muscle can help you actually improve the power output and force of that agonist or prime mover during the movement. Not only can what muscle we're stretching really impact whether or not static stretching is beneficial, and not only can the duration and intensity of the static stretch impact how helpful it is or how much it hinders our results, but we can also change up when we're using the static stretching. They've actually done a really interesting study that showed that interset stretching might actually help us with our strength gains. So by using static stretching in between your sets, you might actually help improve the power of that working muscle. These static stretches used between sets might even improve muscle hypertrophy. So while longer duration and higher intensity static stretching used in your warm-up might hinder your muscle gains, using shorter duration and lower intensity static stretching between your sets might actually help improve your muscle gaining benefits. While interset stretching has some interesting benefits that we want to explore more, using static stretching even as part of a separate mobility routine might be key, especially if you want to focus on strength gains. Because we want to make sure that we're improving our flexibility and our mobility to then help us strengthen through a bigger range of motion. Which brings me to my final question. Does static stretching help prevent injury and even improve your performance in subsequent workouts? Static stretching is just one part of that prehab or rehab process. You also want to make sure to implement foam rolling and activation, because often the static stretching benefits are short-lived if we don't get the correct muscles working. But we do want to use static stretching to improve our flexibility and then help improve our joint mobility. This can then help us strengthen through a full range of motion and make sure that the correct muscles are engaged and working. But again, remember, it's just one part of that prehab process. If you have had previous injuries that you're just returning to exercise from, it might be key that you include static stretching in your warm-up, even if it slightly hinders your performance, because you want to make sure that you're moving well to avoid compensations and injuries. So if you've had a previous hip injury and you're returning to bodyweight workouts and you're doing a squat and you've struggled to really activate your glutes, you might want to include, say, a hip flexor static stretch in your warm-up, even if it then reduces your power output a little bit, because it will make sure that you're actually able to engage your glutes correctly during that squat movement. It's always about the way we're implementing moves to make sure that they're focused on our needs and goals. Low-intensity static stretching can reduce muscle soreness and actually improve your recovery time. So if you're training frequently and you want to make sure that each of your workouts is as beneficial as possible, including some static stretching of low intensity, even if it's slightly longer duration, in your cooldown could help you recover. We want to always think about how we're using different tools to make sure that we're getting the results we want. So static stretching isn't good or bad. It's not black and white. But we always want to make sure that when we're using something, it's focused on our needs and goals. So you might find that you don't include static stretching in your warm-up if you're going for 1 rep max or really focused on performance. However, if you're returning from injury, including some static stretches in your warm-up could be key to making sure that you move well and you don't compensate. It's also really important that we make sure that we use the type of static stretching that we need to our advantage, focusing on shorter, lower intensity holds if we want to make sure that we don't hinder our performance and we actually want to get the best strength gains possible, as well as gain muscle from our workouts might be key. However, we might use longer stretching and even lower intensities if we want to use that to then help us recover for subsequent workouts. Make sure that you're always thinking about your needs and goals when using any of these techniques. But no, static stretching is not good or bad, and there have been a lot of different interesting studies coming out about all the different ways we can use it to benefit us. If you liked the video, make sure to like it, comment below if you have any questions, and subscribe. We're posting new videos each week.